Hi, and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're in a special episode about the recent Michigan regulations changes and the DMI teams and new process that helped to make them. I'm joined by two team members, one from the UP team and one from both the UP and Lower Peninsula team, and we get candid about what really happened and why, and how something with so much promise turned into what one member called a train wreck. So here are the top things to look for during this episode. Were the goals clearly communicated to the teams? What was the criteria for regulation suggestions supposed to be, and was that really followed? What does one guest say was unethical in the UP DMI? Did special interest groups influence the final regulations? Did the DNR and NRC really take this process seriously? Who ultimately failed, the DNR, NRC, or the DMI teams? And what's the solution moving forward for Michigan hunters and our deer herd? And as usual, there's a whole lot more in there, guys. So let's get to the podcast and up your deer IQ. Okay, I'm here with Jordan Hoover and Bob Jones. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to have you guys on. And we're going to be looking at something today that I didn't really plan, but these guys reached out to me, or Jordan did, and this is regarding the DMI teams in Michigan, which is a recent thing that actually I did a co-podcast with Bowhunter Chronicles about kind of the results. And we're going to talk about really what happened on the inside, give these guys feedback on that, and just kind of see what happened, good, bad, or otherwise, with these. Just have an honest conversation about that and the process and everything. So before we dig into particulars on that, because I think people are really interested in that, because thousands of people applied to be part of these teams with under the premise that, hey, we're going to help the DNR and NRC make regulations changes to help the Michigan deer herd and hunters in general, right? And most people obviously got denied. Thousands of people put in for that, but you guys were on the teams. So before we get into some nitty gritty, I guess, questions about that, I'd like to just kind of hear from you guys just a brief background, who you are, your involvement in different things, and how you got chosen for the team, I guess. And we'll start with you, Bob. Tell us a little bit about that and yourself.
Well, I got onto the DMI as part of the stakeholder groups that got let in. I'm currently president of the Michigan Bowhunters Association. I've been a lifelong archer and bow hunter. This year will actually be my 50th consecutive year bow hunting in the state. Unlike some of the kids today, I had to wait till I was 12, and I turned 61 this year, and this will be my 50th year bow hunting. I was a competitive archer for, I don't know, probably 3 decades, traveled all over the country back in my compound days, and shot in many national, state, and world championships during that time.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were on both the UP and LP, or Lower Peninsula DMI teams. Is that right?
Yes, and that was because we did have a rep. His name was Steve Downing, that sat in all the virtual DMI meetings, and at the last minute, they would not let him get off work to attend the in-person meeting. And I was probably the best fit, since I sat in on all of the virtual meetings. To send somebody else that didn't have the same knowledge base that we had probably wouldn't have been very good. So I served in both at the in-person.
Gotcha. So you have a lot of experience, but also, I guess, represent maybe a group, and possibly, I don't know if they told you, but maybe that's part of the reason why you got selected. Okay, so Jordan, tell us a little bit about you and just your background and selection there.
Sure. I'm a born and raised Michigan boy. I'm not actually a full-blooded Uper. I'm kind of a UP stepchild, if you will. I was born and raised in Lower Michigan in my early years, Livingston County area, Pinckney, if you're familiar with that area. when my old man retired from Roush Industries over in Livonia, we moved north to Calumet. And at that point, we lived up here for many, many years. And but we always had strong UP roots. We always came up to the Crystal Falls area down in Iron County for bow camp since, gosh, the post-Vietnam era, my family was coming north. So it was kind of a natural transition when the opportunity happened. And I was gone for a number of years doing some different things, but always returned to the UP when I could, and eventually settled back here in the Baraga County area. And been married 16 years this fall and have 4 sons. So there's 6 of us in this house that all bow hunt, gun hunt, fish, trap, hike, snowshoe, the whole 9 yards. For us, the outdoor lifestyle is just that. It's a lifestyle. It's not recreation for us. It's part of the fiber of who we are in our community here. Like Bob, I've been a diehard archer most all my life. I don't have Bob's competitive resume, but I dipped my toe in the water briefly with that, long enough to come to understand that there wasn't a snowball's chance I was going to take any bread off of Levi Morgan's plate. And as my kids got a little bit older, time's just too short and things had to be let go. That was one of them for me. But, advocacy work has been a lifelong thing for me. It's something I was raised with. My father before me did a lot of the same kinds of things. He was involved with MUCC for a short time. But I was always brought up that stewardship is an action word. And as I became a man, I sought opportunity to engage and plug myself in and live that out.
And you were on the UP team, right?
Yes, I was on the UP team, and I was appointed as an independent, unaffiliated person. I did not represent an organization.
And you actually wrote the final report. Is that correct?
I did, yes.
Okay. All right, so that's kind of the background with you guys. Let's get in, and we'll I guess we'll keep going in that order for now with these questions, Bob, and then Jordan. But first of all, I guess just getting into it. So when you guys got into these teams, what was communicated up front, like right at the beginning? If you give us a picture of that, as far as what was your task and goal? And how was that communicated to you guys?
Our task was laid out to us by Chad Stewart, and our objectives. We had 2 unique circumstances, but different challenges between the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula. And we were told that any of the resolutions or ideas that came forward would have to be backed in biological science with defendable data to move these resolutions forward. And that's where, I know that'll come up later, but I think that's where there was some failure. There was some non-scientific methods, I guess, used in determining, coming both out of the DMI to some part, more I would say more in the Lower Peninsula as far as the scientific portion of it. But the UP, I think we put a very good package together, and defendable with data, defendable with biological science, and unfortunately some of that fell on deaf ears.
So let's talk Lower Peninsula, Bob, for a second. So for Lower Peninsula, were you there for the beginning of that, or were you with the Upper Peninsula for the first part of that?
No, I've been I was in the Lower Peninsula group.
Okay. So did they have actual objectives though? Like, you guys are supposed to do this, or was it just, hey, you're going to come up with suggestions for the NRC?
Well, our objective in the Lower Peninsula group was to primarily the main focus was how we were going to look at regulations to primarily in Zone 3 because of the overabundance of deer in Zone 3, what we could do from a regulatory and non-regulatory standpoint to increase antlerless harvest in Zone 3.
So doe harvest was the main objective then?
In the Lower Peninsula, yes.
Okay. So they didn't say anything about balancing the herd or age structure or anything like that. It was more just, hey, we need to take more does. How do we do that, basically?
Well, I think when you start talking about antlerless harvest, you naturally start bringing that age structure back together, or the buck-doe ratio back together. Anyways, there's unfortunately a lot of ground down here that hunters don't have access to, and I don't think they'll completely solve this antlerless issue unless they solve the access issue. But you'll naturally, through that process, start bringing the ratio closer together. Um, the age structure, that's one of those things that falls into the science. I know a lot of guys are in favor of APRs. I personally practice them, even though I'm opposed to mandatory APRs. Um, there's a lot of science out there telling us right now, coming from biologists all over the nation, that advancing the age structure of the deer herd actually will more rapidly spread CWD. That's some of the science that's out there, but it's still an emerging science. I don't think that anybody knows for sure what the long term uh, effects are going to be of CWD here in Michigan.
All right, Jordan. So the UP, what was your, I guess, and that's a very different situation up there. What was your objectives or stated goals given by the DNR for you guys?
Well, I mean, the UP and the LP teams, I guess I'll start off with this, were together as one group for, I don't know, 2 months, would you say, Bob, about that?
Oh,
When we
okay.
had educational courses. So we had speakers from all different disciplines. We had guys from forestry. We had guys talk about predator-prey relationships. We had discussions about, fawn fecundancy, all those kinds of things. There was a great lineup of highly qualified individuals, both from within the state and from outside the state. And both of our teams participated in the full duration of those things together before we separately conducted our in-person sessions. So as far as, the lead off of the DNR setting forward expectations, I mean, Bob hit the nail on the head. It's grounded in sound science and defensible with data. That was the admonishment from the department right up front. It was very clear. And then they did a very fine job of supplying all the relevant science and all the relevant data to us. So that was great. Objectives for the UP. Obviously, the wolf is always a hot button issue up here, and we certainly didn't manage to avoid that landmine in the course of the DMI. But there was very little to be done, obviously, with the federal situation with the wolves. But it certainly was discussed. Overall, I would say, in broad general terminology, we wanted to see more effective predator management of the species that we have control over. There was concern about the reduction in coyote season that happened earlier this year. There was concern about a record black bear population and growing. And of course, the wolves. And we talked a little bit about trapping too, that trapping seems to be a dying art and what could be done to incentivize that to increase predator harvest. So reducing predator load in broad terminology was a management goal. Tightening sex ratios was a management goal. I'm very comfortable telling you that most places in the UP, save the Banana Belt down in Menominee Garden area, you're looking at 12-1, maybe worse as you go north and west. And, that's the direct result of a decade-long moratorium on antlerless harvest in the Superior watershed. So tightening up sex ratios was a management goal as well. There was some similar talk about age structure, those sorts of conversations. But a lot of our other discussion really centered around non-regulatory matters like habitat improvement. As you may or may not be aware, we have pretty much reached a crisis point with deer winter complex habitat in the UP. We're facing some serious trouble. So that soaked up a lot of time as a non-regulatory agenda item.
Gotcha. So they kind of went through this education process with everybody that you feel sounds like was pretty good as far as getting everybody up to speed on certain things to hopefully have discussions from a educated perspective, right? Once that was done and you kind of had these objectives spelled out for you it sounds like. What happened after that? Like what came next? Let's go start with Bob here.
So what happened next after all of the objectives and stuff were laid out?
Yeah, and the training, it sounds like you guys had some education, a bunch of speakers and stuff. Once that process, part of that was done, what happened next?
We broke out into our weekend-long in-person meetings. The Lower Peninsula met first, and I believe it was 2 weeks later that the Upper Peninsula met for theirs. It may even only been a week later, but I believe it was 2. When we got into our in-person meetings, they split us down on non-regulatory issues, and they divided the room of 20. Actually, there was a couple extras because a few department personnel got to sit in. Divided us into smaller groups where we would key in on what our objective was, what were the main objectives, and we would list those objectives on a piece of paper, then share them with the whole room. And each of the 4 groups would share their objectives, and then they voted on which objectives were the most important, and that's what we moved forward with as far as the non-regulatory. That took up a considerable amount of day 1, and then on day 2 we actually finished up non-regulatory and moved into the regulatory side of things. Again, identifying what the objectives were going to be, what some of the possible solutions were to meet those, and then we voted on those and kind of just kept whittling it down. And unfortunately, in both the Upper Peninsula and the Lower, there were a lot of great ideas that came out in those first go rounds that were really important, that didn't gain the level of support to be moved on to a future, to a recommendation for this year. And hopefully the NRC is considering that totality of all that information going forward and can use some of that stuff in the future.
So you're talking Lower Peninsula now, right?
Right.
So I guess I'm a little confused. So it sounded like they gave you the objective was to reduce doe or increase doe harvest in Lower Peninsula. So what were these other objectives you guys had to talk about?
Well, there was some other objectives that people brought forward. For instance, to increase hunter, 3 R's: recruitment, reactivation, and retention. Different things along those lines. Objectives, there was some in the group that were adamant about antler point restrictions, making that an objective. There were objectives, same as up in the Upper Peninsula, in regards to habitat, because the northern half of the Lower is pretty depleted of habitat, just like much of the UP. So there were some objectives there. There were some objectives of balancing the sex ratios. Baiting, I think I mentioned that already. Yeah, it was baiting, and so all those things were put forward as ideas or things I'd like to achieve, whether they made the final cut or not.
And so I'm just trying to follow from a logical, and I'm trying to be very not take a side on it, but those were objectives above and beyond what the DNR tasked you with, because, or were they ones that, well, we think this will help us reach this stated goal?
Well, I think a lot of them tie together. Let me finish up here. Like baiting, right? Baiting, even though it was denied based on what they're considering the science, I do believe that baiting would increase some of the antlerless harvest. There's some pockets down here in the southeast section of the state. Certainly, it would increase some harvest goals if they allowed baiting. So it was trying to tie some of those together on how to meet the objective of the does, the antlerless harvest.
Gotcha. So what was it like in the UP, Jordan, for your group once you split off and started meeting, like that?
Well, the first thing I want to touch on is I'm not sure if there's confusion afoot here. The Department of Natural Resources did not set the management objectives. The management objectives were set by the respective DMI teams. The department just basically provided all the information, broad spectrum, and said, here you go. We want you to look at this objectively and see what you guys come up with as opposed to what we've come up with. So the department did not direct the management objective. The UP team functioned a little bit differently than the LP team did, because we did have ours a week and a half later, whatever it was. And I think that the department kind of refined their approach a little bit and improved their processes a little bit between the first meeting and our meeting. So we too spent probably the entirety of day one addressing non-regulatory items. We had poster boards butted up to each other, taped to the wall all the way around the entire conference room. There was probably 200 bullet point items that our team members had written down, just kind of, a big idea vomit, if you will. Get everything out, put it on the wall. And once we did that, everybody kind of worked our way through, and we had various votes. Like, they handed out little metallic star stickers at one point, like you'd get from Dollar General or something. And everybody got 5 stars, and you could only put 1 star per item that you would support. So everybody went around the room and read all the recommendations, and okay, I'm going to put a star here and I'm going to put a star there. That was kind of how we narrowed down. But it ate a lot of clock, and we did lose a lot of time on the wolf discussion that day, which was frustrating, simply from the vantage point that it isn't an actionable item for us right now. We're definitely trying to get the conversation out of the weeds and back on point. And we did accomplish that, but it was a struggle at times.
Who was in charge at that point? Like, who was running these meetings?
So there was a young lady there by the name of Alexa Warwick from Michigan State University. And I don't know what her official title was, but basically she runs work groups. This is what she does. I don't know if it's her side hustle or her full-time occupation, but she was kind of proctoring the meeting. And then Chad Stewart and Sarah Thompson were shepherding from the department as well.
Gotcha. So how do you guys feel that process went? Because I'll jump ahead a little bit here, and you guys can kind of fill in the gaps. But I watched the initial, presentation to the NRC, the meeting before the vote, right? So it was kind of the results of this. Here's our what we think, right? And someone, I don't know who it was, it might have been one of you guys. I couldn't tell who it was, but basically said it was a train wreck. I think that's a quote. So what happened in these meetings that was maybe good, but where did it get off?
Well,
So we'll start with Bob.
The department, well, I want to back up just a second too. And Jordan was correct in that the department didn't lay out our objectives for us at the meeting. They talked to us in the virtual meetings about forming some objectives, kind of preluded, but the objectives that came out of it were selected by us in that group.
Do you think that was a mistake on their part?
I don't know. I would like to think that we had enough smart people in the room that we would have come up with the right objectives as well. And a lot of the right objectives did come up in that by the groups, both in the northern and the lower. But as far as a train wreck, the final report that Jordan wrote and the final report that was written by, and I was a part of the dissenting opinion in the Lower Peninsula group writing. Rochelle wrote the dissenting report, and Mike Kettler and Samantha Greenwood wrote the final report. They combined a lot of things. They lumped them all into one category, and I don't know if it was just, I don't know if it was intentional or just when they were looking at, like Jordan said, these poster boards, because we had the same thing, running around the room in circles on what all these objectives were, and a lot of stuff got combined, and it really convoluted the intent of some of the DMI process. And because everything went so fast in the process, we never had an opportunity at the in-person meeting to take each of these items that we moved forward and have a discussion measuring it against scientific and biological data or any kind of defendable data at all. At the end of the day, it kind of got pushed through as the meeting ended because we ran out of time.
Jordan, what about you? Anything to add to that?
I would just echo the sentiment that Bob expressed there, that, time was our biggest enemy. And before this all began, the department, when they were in discussion with the Natural Resources Commission about the DMI and how to construct it and what was the timeline that we were going to have, all these sorts of logistics, the department told the Natural Resources Commission straight out that they needed 10 months to a year. The Natural Resources Commission said, no, you've got 4 months. So we were up against the clock from the very beginning, and that was kind of a theme that continued to be a thorn in our side through the entire process. And it became especially evident during the final phase, which was the in-person session. We had basically a day and a half to craft a complete finished product, an entire management plan. And realistically, as far as the regulatory aspects specifically pertaining to deer regs, we had half a day. At one point, it was the morning of day 2, which was our regulation day. Guys are, staggering in, rubbing sleep out of their eyes with a coffee and a donut. And they're like, all right, everybody grab a seat. Let's go. We're going to start the clock. We're going to give you guys 25 minutes. We want you to put together a regulation package. Say what? It was rushed. It was terribly rushed. It was very compressed. And I put it in the conclusion for my final report that ultimately what my team put out lacks the polish of a truly finished product, and that it was uniform across all of us, that we wish we had more time to truly sharpen things up, dot the I's and cross the T's, but that we felt we got in the ballpark, as I termed it. What made it a train wreck? Well, being blunt, Adam, some of the special interest groups in the UP made it a train wreck. They were very, very difficult to work with, and there was an agenda afoot from day one. There were private side meetings being held and some vote wrangling going on. There was just things happening that shouldn't have been happening, is the bottom line. And there was a lot of undue influence exerted there. I frankly don't think it was very ethical. And unfortunately, we had a situation where one of the special interest group leaders from the UP actually rode down to the Natural Resources Commission meeting with a UP commissioner, where coincidentally enough, everything that particular individual had asked for got approved. I'm not much for conspiracy theories and trying to connect dots that don't exist. But at some point, I don't believe in coincidence, Adam. I believe in looking objectively at chains of events that point to an outcome, and that's what we had.
So before I forget about this, there's a lot in there I want to ask about. But so what can you say what that special interest group was and what those items were?
Which items?
Well, you just said that a person in a special interest group rode with an NRC member, and those items that they were supporting.
Yeah, sure. So the UP Whitetails Association and the Upper Peninsula Sportsmen's Alliance were both organizations that I would be referencing in this discussion. And as far as the things that they were bringing to the table, they wanted 2 different sets of buck regulations for the UP, and most dangerously, basically a complete antlerless harvest moratorium except for Menominee and Garden area. Doubling down on policies we've had for the last 10 years that have absolutely been killing us. There were a couple of other things in there that they had that were similar to us. They were looking for some predator reduction, which was fine. They wanted an up-to-date wolf management plan. That was fine. But as far as the contentious items, it's deer management. It's not buck management. And when you're staring 12-to-1 ratios in the face, there's a devastating biological cascade that happens, and we've got to fix it. Unfortunately, those particular individuals are stuck in 1970, and it's the Bush-like gospel of Papa said, we don't shoot no does.
Gotcha. Yeah. So my background, I'm a teacher, right? I've been doing that for this is my 23rd year. And when you guys talk about the person that led your groups, I forget the name you said, but it's a person that specializes in that. That's something that's very familiar to me. It's a very, progressive in culture thing. This is how we do this. We put these boards up and we write stuff on them, and they push these trends in education, and it's exactly what you guys did, right? And what I find a lot of times is when you do that, you don't get to the truth very well or very quickly, and it's very inefficient. It makes people feel like they're all a big part of something, but it usually doesn't work out real well. It's really much better practice to have a strong leader, and you get right down to it, and you drill down to certain things quickly and more efficiently. Sounds to me like that's kind of what you guys did with the stickers and the stars and stuff. Is it wasn't effective? I mean, am I correct in saying that?
I would say that it was a very inefficient use of the time. I think it could have been much more streamlined.
I would agree with that. And if we had more time, I think if they would have split the non-regulatory and regulatory into two different weekends, and we had a weekend for each, to where we could dissect these a little bit more, or even if the DMI would have been tasked with just immediate things that we could do for the 2024 season, and let us focus on the short-term goals that we could come up with during this process, and then at a later date reconvene for longer term, long term plan. But there certainly are some things that could benefit us short term, and we should have focused on that, I believe.
With the short time crunch and stuff, do you guys feel that the DNR and NRC, and we'll treat those differently, they're different entities, but comment on both of them maybe. Do you feel they took this seriously? Because from my perspective, and a lot of people that volunteered to do this and got selected, that took it very seriously. Like, we're being a part. They're actually going to listen to us. They're actually going to, give us time and voice in this. Do you guys feel that's what happened? Okay, so here's your high IQ moment. How do you view data and hunting? Do you just kind of guess when it comes to when and where you hunt, or view it in an analytical sense? There are many types of hunters out there, but I've found for higher odds success that using data or intel is king. This comes by various means of scouting, including glassing, proper trail camera use, foot scouting, and observation hunts, just to name a few. All these go together to help a savvy hunter make the most informed decisions and take as much of the guesswork out of it as possible. I call this surgical hunting or a strategic strike, and this high IQ method allowed me to get 5 shots at good bucks last year in just 7 hunts. It's just very effective, and what we're discussing on some of our podcasts a bit this year. And if you want those kind of results, our new DRIQ test is the first step. It's a totally different test than the one last year. This is a comprehensive objective assessment based on 6 core competencies that highly effective hunters have to have. It reveals strengths and exactly where to focus to take it to the next level. And there's no other tool in the industry that does this. And it includes a free coaching session as well to help you take the results and set highly effective hunting goals that will lead to actual hunting results. So if you want to consistently take the top deer where you hunt, this tool's for you. Sign up below for the new Deer IQ assessment today. All right, and let's get back to the podcast. With the short time crunch and stuff, do you guys feel that the DNR and NRC, and we'll treat those differently, they're different entities, but comment on both of them maybe. Do you feel they took this seriously? Because from my perspective, and a lot of people that volunteered to do this and got selected, that took it very seriously. Like, we're being a part. They're actually going to listen to us. They're actually going to, give us time and voice in this. Do you guys feel that's what happened?
In the beginning, I thought that both of them took it very seriously, and I can tell you that Chad Stewart, our deer elk and moose specialist, he bent over backwards. He made himself available via telephone to all the DMI members. He worked tirelessly through this, and I think he has a lot of passion for the resource. And I believe that the department does as well, and I believe they took it seriously. In the end, I have a hard time believing, as unprepared as some of the commissioners were at the NRC meetings, at both the work group and when they took the vote, I had a hard time feeling that some of them actually took it seriously.
What about you, Jordan?
I have a similar mindset on it. All the department staff and DNR speakers, experts in different fields that we dealt with, bar none, everybody that we dealt with, I thought was very professional, very knowledgeable, very thorough, and very personable, passionate about what they do. It was very clear that it wasn't just a job, that there was deep personal investment. And that spoke to me. You wonder sometimes, are you just getting the wool pulled over your eyes? And being able to have conversations with them on a personal level, you get to see the fiber of the man or woman behind the name tag. And I think that the DNR was very well represented by the individuals that were present. The commission, did they take it seriously? I think that the commission thought that the DMI was going to be a get out of jail free card for them. I think they thought that we were going to do effectively all of their legwork in partnership with the DNR and hand them a gift wrap package that they could just put a bow on and say, okay, yep, we like this. Let's go with that. Unfortunately, it didn't go that way. They didn't get what they wanted. And I think that unfortunately our Natural Resources Commission is more politically than biologically motivated. Let's be honest, they're political appointees. That's probably a bad way to start. I do not think that the vast majority of our commissioners had the requisite level of knowledge on the subject matters at hand to parse the information and make an informed, justifiable, defensible decision. And I think that became very evident, like you mentioned, during the initial DMI workday, it was called, preceding the July meeting. The disorganization and the fumbling and bumbling was rampant. It was terrible. It was a very bad look for the commission. And, the politest way to say it was, for anyone watching, it appeared as though the commissioners showed up to class having not done their homework. And I'm sure that resonates with a teacher.
Yeah, I understand what that's like. So you would say, if I'm hearing you correctly, both you guys, the DNR had it together, the NRC did not?
Yep.
I would agree with that.
And the NRC is the ones that kind of pushed the timeline, and the DNR really couldn't do much about that. Is that also true?
Correct.
Okay. So you guys made some suggestions, and again, I kind of watched some of that. I couldn't watch it all. It was a long meetings, right? And some of it just kind of bothered me too. But so you guys made suggestions. You didn't have time to actually get science, right? And so you're saying, Jordan, that you think your interpretation is that they were hoping you do all the homework for them and they would just check a box, right? How was there any communication in between? Because as I read the recommendations and some of those things, it seemed like on my end, not being in the group, but just reading these, it seemed like there was a lack of communication somewhere about these, and it could have been very well solved, some of this stuff, if there was just communication back and forth. Like you actually worked at it to get it to a point where even with the DNR, like, okay, we would support this, and hand them some better things that they could actually vote on, if that makes sense, right? It just seemed like, again, from my just reading stuff and looking at it, that there was just a lack of communication, where if these two groups could have got together and just talked more back and forth, there could have been a better result.
Well, you're in the ballpark of part of the problem, Adam. And at the tail end of this, I wrote a letter to the commission, just personally, not on behalf of the DMI or anything of that. It was a personal letter. I sent it to all the commissioners, and I talked about the battle that we faced as a team with this time crunch and my misgivings about the lack of a finished product. That it should not be viewed as a complete management package. It should not be viewed as finished. It's close. It's a rough draft. That's all this is. I put that in my final report.
Mm-hmm.
And I told the commissioners in my letter that, and I was aware of the DMI workday at that point. I said, to me, it would make sense to have the teams present for the workday, or at least the report writing committees. That way, if there's any need for clarity, you want to ask questions about, okay, well, we see regulation A here. How did you arrive at that conclusion? Can you share your rationale with us, please?
Mm-hmm.
And, just to be able for our teams, having put 4 months worth of work in this start to finish, to be there at the finish line, I thought would have been good business. And it would eliminate any miscommunication. The DNR thought that would be a good idea. Unfortunately, the commission did not. The response that I received was that they would be holding 3-minute public comment, and I was welcome to drive 500 miles for my 3 minutes if I would like.
Interesting. What are your thoughts on that, Bob?
I was at the in-person work group meeting. I didn't have a 500-mile one-way drive. And I gave my 3 minutes of comment. But as Jordan had stated, during this whole thing, they took all of these resolutions that they put up on the board, and they started kind of with a go around of yes or no. Is there anything that's unanimously a yes or unanimously a no? And some of those things got categorized that way. And then they built this roadmap for future consideration. Well, some of the problems, especially with the Upper Peninsula resolution that was put forth, it was a working package. There were compromises made in there, and to take any one single part out of that basically is like taking a couple of spokes out of a wheel. It's going to run, but eventually the tire is going to fail, right? So that was a complete package. It was probably more complete of a package than the Lower Peninsula was. The Lower Peninsula had expanding APRs, $1 and earn a second buck. Well, those were all ideas that were put out there, but they were never meant to be all inclusive of one regulation. We weren't going to go to a APR on a single buck with an earn it don't even make sense. You can't go to a $1 and earn a second buck together. And so they just kind of picked and choose off the board anything that they could support or, deny or have discussion. And after the 3-minute commentary, there was some questions asked of the people in the room on what the intent of the DMI was, but not nearly enough back and forth to get clear, concise. And that was probably some of the problem with the information put up on the whiteboards in the room to start with, the poster boards, was you didn't have room to write the entire thing down. So it was just an idea or a thought put up there, but it wasn't specific enough, and in many instances got misinterpreted as the intent of that entire idea.
Yeah, when you do that stuff, that's just a brainstorm session. That's in no way even close to a rough draft, let alone a final draft, right?
A lot of detail.
Yeah. So it wasn't given enough time. Seems like some lack in leadership and communication. And then they just voted on these things, right? Almost like, again, my interpretation, but kind of what you said, Jordan, where, okay, you guys just put together this stuff and we'll just vote yea or nay without us being involved at all or much, and even having a background knowledge about why and how these all fit together. And like you're saying, Bob, when I read through the recommendations the first time, I was kind of confused. Exactly what you're saying is like, how do all these work together? They're saying this and this. How is that going to flesh out or work out in actual regulations? And now that you explain it, it makes sense that wasn't really a final draft.
No, that's where we left it at the end of the day. And then none of those suggestions, like I said, at the end of the day, We were out of time when that final draft got put on the board, and never did we go back and measure any of those to what they would do to meet our objectives of reducing the antlerless harvest, increasing the antlerless harvest. I'm sorry, or what would that do to bring sex ratios closer together? What would it do to bring new hunters in? None of them were measured against any biological science or proven data.
Yeah, and I talked to Chad Stewart last summer, did a really long podcast with him, asked him a lot of questions, and then the DMI thing came out after that, and I felt for quite a while that even the underlying goals that the state has and the DNR has really needed to be looked at before you even can set regulations, and then how these regulations are going to actually meet those goals. And it just seems like all that stuff is kind of messed up. So they voted on these things, and really, from my perspective, there's a lot of hope that things would be different and they'd adopt some of these things. I was talking to one guy who's pretty involved in a whitetail group, and he was really hoping for APRs and maybe one buck, and then in Lower Peninsula, and then none of that happens, right? And in my perspective, not much different changed, right? And you guys can correct me, but especially Lower Peninsula, right? They open some longer doe seasons. Okay, the DNR knows that really doesn't take more does, not substantially, right? But they just did it. Why? I don't know. Maybe you guys can help with that one. But they, took muzzleloader and opened it up to any gun, right, in Lower Peninsula, and they opened up public land to the youth season, right, and then it's doe only in 2025. Did I miss anything else there, Bob, with the Lower Peninsula?
No, I think that just about covers it. The extended seasons and all that, while it creates some extra opportunity and it looks like we're doing something, if you look at the harvest reports that as they come in real time, as the season goes on, it's very much diminishing returns on your harvest. People just aren't wanting to be out there in the middle of January. They've got all the hunting in they wanted at that time, and it's not going to make any measurable difference in the areas that we have with real high deer density. It's like teaspoon water out of the ocean. It's just some of these pockets. And Jordan came down and had an opportunity to do an early hunt this year, I know, and he got to see firsthand the deer densities in some of the areas down here by where I'm at. And if you harvest another 4 or 5 antlerless deer in these late season, or 100 deer, it's really just a drop in the bucket from what really needs to happen.
Yeah. So in the UP, Jordan, what changes did they make up there? I'm a little less aware of those and how those might impact what's going on up there.
One of the changes I want to touch on first that would be statewide for 2025, you mentioned the antlerless change for the youth. That's also been extended to liberty and independence for the disabled and combat wounded veterans. They will no longer have the option to harvest a buck during those special hunts starting 2025, which, since we're on that subject, I found reprehensible that they would do that. When you look at the spectrum, like Bob said, the teaspoon analogy, all of those special early season hunts combined account for less than 3% of the total annual harvest statistically. So I don't understand how harnessing them with the responsibility of taking down all these does is in any way competent. It's statistically irrelevant. So I'm certainly not inside the mind of the commissioners, and I can't begin to speculate why they would do that. They're supposed to base everything they do on the best available sound scientific evidence. I don't think there's any scientific evidence that supports that decision. So for UP, it's a real boondoggle. The things that my team agreed upon that were in our final report, our recommendations to the NRC, got absolutely blown out of the water in a matter of minutes. And coincidentally, the B board, which was one of our poster boards, the old coffee clutch club, I call them, with the anti-dough harvest and all of that jazz. The B board was ultimately pretty much what got enacted, basically against the wishes of our team and counter to the vote of our team. So we didn't change a whole lot. We doubled down on bad policy that we've had for a long, long time. One of the things that was done, however, is they did reduce the special access permits. Are you familiar with those, Adam?
Fill us in if people aren't.
Okay, so in very quick conversation, about 3 years ago, they established a collection of DMUs in the Central East and Central West UP. They created 2 new DMUs, 351 and 352. And they established an antlerless quota of 1,000 for East and 1,000 for West. And they were any weapon tags. So it's bow, rifle, muzzleloader, doesn't matter. One of the changes is that they reduced the Eastern DMU special access permit quota to 0 effective this year. And they reduced the Western quota to 500. Other than that, everything else was pretty much kept in place. They did take away some more antlerless opportunity in that kind of central southern region of the UP. So there's less opportunity for doe with a bow now in some of those regions.
So basically, kind of what we've been saying is that they did those and they didn't even support them with science. Like, what science would support this to help the deer herd? And on top of that, talk a little bit more about, so you did basically within your team, a sub team branch off and kind of do their own thing. And it kind of became this multi-party group or something.
Yeah, you could say that there was a handful of, I'll just call them the old guard, that kind of went rogue. When the in-person meeting finished, they were very upset that their recommendation package wasn't part of the final product. It got voted down. There just wasn't enough support for it in our group. So those ideas got blown off the table. And then ultimately, we were left with boards A and board C. And we had kind of a line item vote between the 2 regulation packages and played a little Tetris. And it's kind of, the final recommendation was basically a patchwork quilt of boards A and C. The old guard was extremely unhappy, vocally so. I mean, we had a guy get up and leave the meeting. We had 2 guys refuse to continue to participate in the meeting. The full court press was on in the hotel lobby that day before we even left. They were hollering and carrying on. Very upset, very upset. And behind closed doors, there was a lot of things that happened leading up to those commission meetings that I can't even begin to speak to, but suffice it to say, their recommendations that my team voted out wound up on the table, and that's what was voted in by the commission.
So it sounds like some dysfunction, some, almost like Survivor Island where people are pitting against each other and forming alliances and stuff. That's dysfunction on a large scale there. And that's where these recommendations they got voted in came from. So there's a lot of not good things going on there, if I could just kind of give an overview of that. So this is where we are now, kind of moving forward. What did they say about from the future here on out? Are they going to continue to do this sort of thing with DMIs and say, hey, this wasn't perfect, let's improve them in this way, but we still want to have these sort of things? Did they say anything like that to you guys? Like, do you know their plans from here on out?
The commission alluded, the chair, Tom Barrett, alluded that the DMI was going to stay together in some kind of advisory capacity, but did not say how. And I think it'd be a good idea for them to start from scratch with an entire new panel of members and go through that entire education process is costly and, a loss of time. I think that we had a pretty good core group in both the upper and the lower. Um, and I think there's a lot of work to be done still. I'm more upset with the result of the Upper Peninsula DMI because the overabundance of deer down here, yeah, it's troubling and really needs to be addressed. But I think that the recommendations that ended up coming out of the NRC, the regulations, and staying on with much of the same, that we quite potentially are a winter away from having our deer herd again, from what we have up there. I think that they potentially done a lot of potential damage to the deer herd in the Upper Peninsula with their choices that they made. I don't know if Jordan, I think he would probably agree with that, but I think the problem that we have down here with too many deer, while it certainly needs to be addressed, I think it's an easier challenge than what they have up in the upper. The habitat is so depleted up there. We're pushing deer into the wintering complexes with not enough food. Um, our buck to doe ratio is probably worse than it is anywhere else in the state. Um, I just got to continue to keep praying for mild winters in the UP.
So,
Jordan,
yeah, anything to add to that, Jordan?
This whole DMI thing, it's not a new idea. It's been done before. A lot of people may not remember, but back in the late 90s, following the record-breaking winters in 96, 97 that we had here in the UP, they formed RDAT, which was Regional Deer Advisory Team, similar to the DMI. Similar goals, bring fresh perspective to the table. How do we fix what's broken? The DMI was different because there was a place for independent, unaffiliated people at the table rather than simply traditional stakeholder group leadership. But, it's plausible to think that this will occur in some shape or form again in the future based on past precedent. I have heard some conversation that there was intention to keep the DMI together. In what form, they weren't really sure. That's been kind of kept quiet. I'm not certain how interested the commission is going to be in doing that, because I think that they have taken a great deal of flack for how they've handled it, and I don't think they're coping well.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I'll just insert this here, and again, I wasn't on the teams, but it just seems like one of those things that you see in corporations. I see them in education, where even politics, right? And this is where this gets political, is that you do something like this, it could be a good thing, but a lot of times it turns into potentially something that's just for looks, right? Oh, we're getting input and that makes people feel good, but we're just going to do what we want to do anyways. And it almost feels like that's kind of what it turned into from my perspective. So let's look at the future here. So what do you guys think are the solutions? You can mention regulations, but I'd say more to the issue with regulations and how we approach those, and these team type things, and just the NRC and how they put things into regulations into law. Like, what do you guys think are the solutions going forward? We'll start with Bob.
It was pointed out really clearly to us, all of the regulation buttons that they can play with um, move the needle very little on deer management. And they've tried pretty much everything that they can as far as who can hunt, where you can hunt, how many deer you can shoot, the season lengths, and none of that is correcting anything down here in the Lower Peninsula. I think one of the things that was most clear to me coming out of the DMI, both in the upper and the lower, was that regulatory changes by themselves aren't going to solve this issue. The habitat issues in the Upper Peninsula are all non-regulatory. In the Lower Peninsula, I spoke before the DMI members were ever even seated when they were talking, when it was just a concept, that the department couldn't solve the deer density issues in the Lower Peninsula without first solving the access issues. If you lay a map out of all the really high deer density areas in Zone 3, they all fall on private property. And we as hunters simply can't harvest deer that we don't have access to. And none of the stuff pertaining to that falls on regulatory issues. It's going to take a huge educational campaign, encouraging both farmers that are landowners and private property owners that are non-agriculture to get some people in on their property to help in the Lower Peninsula. Habitat in the Upper Peninsula is non-regulatory. The NRC has no control over it, and that needs to be fixed.
That's where I would say this, and I wrote an article before the teams met. It was in Woods and Water, and I proposed a lot of very different regulations changes, and I think you actually can put but they'd have to be very, very different regulations to start, moving the needle some. I agree with the land stuff and the access, but that's where you can look at education and programs, right? What type of programs is the state putting in place that incentivizes private landowners to allow hunting? Stuff like that. Like, you'd have to really get outside the box, much bigger and much different changes than just, let's extend the doe season a little bit. Right? That's not going to do anything. It's just like you guys said, drop in the bucket. You'd have to get very drastic, I think, with your regulation changes, and I don't think they're willing to do that. Like, I think they don't want to do what it requires to have significant change. If they're scared or whatever it might be, they just don't have what it takes to make big changes and make a big stance. That's my thoughts on it. Jordan, what do you think as far as our path forward? Like, where do we go? Like, what'll fix this?
Oh, that's not going to be a short answer, but I'll try to make it as brief as I can, Adam. So where we currently reside in the state of Michigan with our natural resources decision-making process today is this. We continue to give the truck a tune-up and put in fresh spark plugs and do a nice oil change and gas it up, make sure we've got, everything looking good, detail it all out. But the gosh darn truck needs a new transmission. So all the other stuff doesn't matter. So the new transmission is the Natural Resources Commission. It is the process by which we make these regulations and the individuals charged with upholding Proposal G. That's where the problem lies. As I said earlier, I worked with some really fantastic, very knowledgeable, passionate, dedicated people in the Department of Natural Resources. They're not the problem, Adam. The problem is that our Department of Natural Resources is basically as ineffectual as the DMI. They're a glorified advisory team to the Natural Resources Commission who may turn up their nose whenever they feel like it. The commission is appointed by the governor. We talked about them being political appointees earlier. So oddly enough, in a governmental system in which there are all these checks and balances theoretically built into the system, there is no check and there is no balance against the absolute authority of the commission. And that becomes a problem when you have individuals who display a complete lack of requisite knowledge on the subject matter, like we saw in both the DMI workday and the July vote as well. We effectively had deer regs made by a bunch of trout fishermen. And I guess I'd feel a lot better if we were talking about brook trout creel limits and, what sections of rivers we should impose different steelhead regulations on. But unfortunately, we made deer regs with trout fishermen. And when individuals have a lack of knowledge, naturally what they want to do is they want to defer to people that they perceive to be knowledgeable in that subject matter. And when you're an NRC commissioner, all too often, those individuals are the heads of special interest groups. Whether or not those individuals are truly knowledgeable and exercising integrity and advocating for sound science is another matter. unfortunately, some of them are not. And when you have individuals influencing our commissioners and by proxy influencing the decision-making process, and that process is not grounded in sound scientific evidence, there can be no other outcome than a bad one, Adam.
Yeah, and so if I'm hearing you right, and this is where I'd say I think the solution is legislative at this point, where we really got, honestly, we got the NRC. We changed how that's set up, and really in Michigan, it being such a different state with so many different resources in our Great Lakes, I would think it would make sense to have a NRC that is separate, that is just deer hunting, right? That is deer hunting experts, and legislatively that would be something that people actually vote on, right? There's your keeping accountable, right? And you actually have to have a resume and say why you should be voted for this position, and it'll last so many years, and then you have to be accountable to your record too. And maybe that would be the fix at this point. But as you say, yeah, they're just appointed, and that's kind of that. They have ultimate authority with whatever is put in front of them, right? And I think we kind of see the results of that, unfortunately. So, as we kind of wrap up here, guys, I think another something I'll throw out there is just, you know, as individuals, we have quite a bit of QDM type stuff that goes on in Michigan. Do you guys feel that is part of the solution, as of like, hey, if the regulations aren't helping us, if whatever's going on in Lansing isn't helping us, we can take more control of our areas by setting our own. Bob, you mentioned you do your own basically APRs, right? I mean, do you guys think that at least that's part of the solution?
Yeah, yes and no. Each time that the regulations have changed, and they've moved different levers, antlerless harvest didn't increase down here in Zone 3. Um, I think if you drop an APR down into, like, say, Hillsdale, Jackson County, it's not going to have the same effect that it had up in the Northwest 13. There's too many deer on the landscape currently down here. All that's going to do is the private landowners down there in those counties who already have a half dozen of target bucks each year on their property, all that's going to do is advance the age structure of their deer a year older. They're going to shoot some nicer deer than they're already currently harvesting, but it's not going to increase the antlerless harvest. And one of the things that I was behind in the DMI was the year and a second buck. I think that's one thing that maybe would have moved the needle before anybody could harvest a second buck. They had to shoot an antlerless deer down here in Zone 3. But even that, with the small percentage of hunters that actually shoot 2 deer, even that's a negligible number at the end of the day on antlerless harvest. I think, like the NDA and QDMA, I think they do some great things habitat wise and stuff, but I don't think it's a blanket across the state. I think they need to go to a more smaller DMU management level goals for deer harvest on does. Some of the problems we have, and one of the ladies that was in our group that spoke last week at the NRC meeting and has been very vocal throughout this whole process, Rochelle Hubbard. She spoke at great lengths about managing at smaller levels. I think what happens to some degree with these unlimited antlerless tags, guys think, well, my neighbor can get 10 tags, so I'm not going to shoot any of those because my neighbor's going to shoot 10. And we need to get real numbers and real facts out there. And I think more people would be willing to harvest some antlerless deer if they didn't think that the DNR's intent or the NRC's intent was to just shoot all the doggone deer, and I don't believe that it is their intent, but we definitely need to reduce some numbers down here.
Any final thoughts there, Jordan?
Two. So I'll kind of answer your question, piggyback on Bob, and then there's kind of a short segue I want to make. I think what you're speaking to, Adam, is not necessarily QDM per se, but are collaboratives, perhaps. Maybe that's a better word, the way of the future. Individuals that band together in their communities that have similar ideas, like mind, like management goals, and they sit around, they talk about it at the family diner over coffee, or they talk about it at the gun club, and everybody says, yeah, that sounds good, we should do that. And that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Can that be possible? Is that a path forward? Well, yeah, I think it's viable. It's viable. The counter argument against that is you put 10 deer hunters in a room and you will have 15 opinions, and somebody will adamantly disagree that deer are in fact not brown. That's just the nature of Michigan deer hunters. We tend to infight quite a bit. Unity is a problem. And I think this whole fiasco with the Natural Resources Commission, especially here in the UP, really violated a lot of trust for guys. There's been a long storied history of a broken relationship between UP hunters and Lansing. And for the first time in my lifetime, I've seen optimism for change during this DMI process. And, a lot of guys saw that I was involved, and they know what a staunch advocate for sound science I am, and that I hunt my ass off. Spend thousands of hours a year in season and out in the woods, stomping the ground, doing the work. And they thought, man, we've got a shot because we've got some people that are like us. And I think this really took the air out of the tires. And unfortunately, what that has done, or fortunately as it may be, is push people away from whatever management plan that the department and the NRC might be bringing to the table, and more towards an attitude of, okay, we know our land, we know our herd, and we need to handle our business. It's a two-edged sword, Adam. Mm-hmm. Time will tell if that's good or bad. But the way forward from here, how do we fix what's broken? One of the most broken things in the state of Michigan is hunter engagement. I've spoken about this on several other podcasts, and it can't be overstated. You go to a Natural Resources Commission meeting, there's 15, 20 guys on average. There's the House and the Senate Natural Resources Subcommittee meetings. Nobody goes. DNR educational meetings, all those kinds of things, by and large, not very well attended. Michigan hunters are people, I believe, who tend to avoid political entanglements. The woods, the waters, the rivers, that's our church. We go there to avoid all the ruckus and all the noise of life. And politics isn't our first choice. We don't like those things. Unfortunately, politics are a necessary evil in the way our natural resources decision-making process is currently structured. And if we don't engage, we lose. And I think it's important to point out that there is another side. There is a cross-section of the population that isn't favorable to hunting. There's another cross-section of the population that just flat out wants our way of life gone. And those people are sending people to these meetings. They're spending money on lobbyists. They're doing all these things. They're engaged. And we have to do a better job educating our ranks in the hunting and outdoor community that we too need to be engaged.
Yeah, I think there's definitely work to be done for sure. And hopefully, if you're out there listening, you're from Michigan, which I would assume if you were listening to this, you are. I guess that'd be my last message: is don't disengage. This might be very frustrating for a lot of people, but we got to find ways. So I'll kind of wrap it up there, guys. But I really appreciate you joining, Jordan and Bob, and just sharing what that experience was like and just your thoughts on it. So thanks again for joining.
Thank you so much for having us, Adam.
Thank you so much for having us. I agree.
Okay, so here are your high IQ takeaways and challenges. So maybe you're disappointed in our bureaucratic system. Yes, many are. But my challenge is to actually not complain, but find ways to be a part of a positive solution, whatever that may be. That's the only path forward, and we need to not give up in that pursuit. And how many spots do you need to be able to have a good chance at a deer you want to shoot every time you hunt. We'll talk about that transformational approach as we continue with Summer Prep Essentials next week. You won't want to miss it, and I'll see you then.